The night began without warning, the kind of ordinary evening that quietly turns into something unforgettable, and Ethan Miller did not know it yet, but everything he believed about loyalty, timing, and fate was about to shift as he packed up his desk on the 32nd floor of a glass office building in downtown Seattle, long after most employees had left, the city outside dark and restless, rain tapping sharply against the windows as if trying to get someone's attention. Ethan had stayed late again, not because he loved overtime, but because Richard Collins, his boss, expected perfection, and Ethan had built his career on being reliable, invisible, and good at what he did, the kind of man people trusted without really knowing. And as he stood, stretching his stiff shoulders, turning off the lights row by row, he noticed a figure near the elevators, a woman standing still as if unsure whether to leave or stay, her posture calm but tired, and it took a moment for him to recognize her as Claire Collins, Richard's wife, someone he had only seen a few times at company events, always polite, always composed, always carrying herself like someone who had learned to wait. She wore a light coat, her hair slightly loose, her phone in her hand with a dim screen, and when their eyes met, there was a brief moment of surprise, then recognition, and then something else, relief, maybe, that neither of them spoke out loud, and Ethan felt awkward immediately, unsure if he should pretend not to notice her or say something, but before he could decide, the elevator bell rang, then stopped, then went dark again, and Claire let out a quiet breath, not dramatic, just tired, and said softly that the elevators had been acting up all evening and that Richard was still in meetings across town, her voice steady but distant, like she was explaining facts rather than feelings, and Ethan nodded, feeling a strange sense of responsibility even though nothing had been asked of him. And outside, thunder rolled low, the rain growing heavier, flooding the streets below, and without fully thinking it through, he said it was raining badly and that he was heading out anyway and that if she needed a ride home, he could help, and the words surprised even him as they left his mouth. But Claire did not react sharply or suspiciously, she simply looked at him for a second longer than necessary, as if measuring the offer not for danger but for meaning, and then she agreed with a quiet thank you. That carried more weight than it should have, and within minutes they were walking side by side through the lobby, the building nearly empty, the security guard nodding without interest, the doors sliding open to a rush of cold air and rain, and as they hurried toward Ethan's car, their steps careful on the wet pavement, the city felt smaller, closer, wrapped in the sound of rain and traffic, and once inside the car, the warmth settled in quickly, fogging the windows, creating a private space neither had planned, and they drove off, the wipers moving fast, streetlights blurring past, silence filling the space not with tension but with something thoughtful, and Ethan focused on the road while Claire looked out the window, her reflection faint in the glass, and after a few minutes she spoke, not about the rain or traffic, but about waiting, about how life sometimes feels like standing in a long hallway where every door is closed, and Ethan answered honestly, faster than he usually spoke, saying that he often felt like he was moving forward without knowing where he was going, just following expectations, deadlines, responsibilities, and the conversation flowed easily, skipping small talk, moving straight into shared understanding, not romantic, not improper, just two adults recognizing loneliness in each other without naming it. And as they crossed the bridge toward her neighborhood, Claire mentioned how Richard loved his work, how it consumed him, how she admired it and yet felt left behind by it, and Ethan listened, careful not to judge, careful not to insert himself where he did not belong, but he felt something shift inside him, a quiet awareness that this woman was not just his boss's wife but a person with unanswered thoughts and long nights. And when they reached her house, a large home sitting dark against the rain, she hesitated before opening the door, thanking him again, telling him the ride mattered more than he realized, and for a moment Ethan thought she might say more, but instead she smiled, a soft, tired smile that stayed with him long after she stepped out into the rain and walked toward her front door. And as he drove away, the city lights reflecting on the wet road, Ethan felt unsettled, not with guilt, but with a sense that something had begun without permission, something quiet and emotional, and he told himself it was nothing, just kindness on a rainy night, but deep down, he knew that ordinary nights do not linger like this one did. And as the rain continued to fall, Ethan realized the shock was not what had happened, but how deeply it had already stayed with him. The days after that rainy night moved faster than Ethan expected, as if time itself had decided not to slow down for his confusion, and part 2 of the story unfolded not in one dramatic moment but in many small, restless ones that kept pulling at his thoughts while he tried to focus on work, deadlines, and routine. Every morning he arrived at the office earlier than usual, hoping for calm, yet finding his mind drifting back to the quiet drive, to Claire's voice, to the honesty that had slipped out between traffic lights, and although he told himself it meant nothing, his body reacted before logic could catch up, his attention sharpening whenever he heard footsteps in the hallway or saw a familiar shape through the glass walls. But Claire did not appear at the office again, not that week, and the absence only made the memory stronger. Ethan buried himself in projects, pushing reports across Richard's desk, earning nods of approval, yet each compliment felt hollow, because the man across from him seemed distant in a different way now, distracted, shorter in patience, often canceling meetings, leaving early, returning late, and whispers floated quietly among coworkers about pressure at home and strain no one dared name out loud, and Ethan hated himself for noticing, hated that his concern was no longer professional but personal, and one evening, as he left the building under clear skies, his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number, and he nearly ignored it until a simple message appeared. "Thank you again for the other night. I hope you're well, Claire," and that was all it took to send his heart into a sharp, fast rhythm, not excitement exactly, but awareness, the kind that wakes something long asleep. He replied politely, carefully, keeping the words safe, and yet the conversation grew, not long, not frequent, but meaningful, messages exchanged every few days about books, about the city, about moments that felt too small to share with anyone else, and then one evening, by coincidence or fate, Ethan ran into Claire at a small cafe near the waterfront, a place quiet enough to hear waves hitting the dock, and neither pretended surprise, both smiling with the recognition of people who had already met in a deeper way, and they talked for an hour, then two, not about Richard directly, but about lives that had taken turns neither had expected, Claire admitting she felt invisible in her own marriage, not unloved, just unseen, and Ethan confessing that he had built his life around being useful, dependable, safe, never daring to ask what he wanted, and the honesty between them felt clean, not secretive, not rushed, and when they parted that night, it was with a sense of restraint that made everything stronger, because neither crossed a line, neither reached out, neither promised anything, yet something undeniable had taken shape, and the shock of part 2 was not a kiss or a confession, but the realization that connection could exist without wrongdoing, that emotions could grow quietly, patiently, like a truth waiting for the right moment. And as weeks passed, their meetings remained accidental in appearance but intentional in meaning, walks during lunch breaks where conversations stayed thoughtful, phone calls that ended before they became too personal, and Ethan wrestled with his loyalty, knowing Richard trusted him, yet understanding that feelings were not actions. And then one afternoon, the truth shifted again when Richard called Ethan into his office and spoke openly, admitting that his marriage had been strained for months, that Claire had pulled away not out of anger but exhaustion, and that they were living separate emotional lives under the same roof, and Ethan listened in silence, the weight of knowledge pressing on him, realizing that what he felt had not created the distance, but had grown in the space already there, and that understanding shocked him more than anything else, because it forced him to face the fact that life was rarely clean or simple, that timing mattered as much as intention. And as part 2 closed, Ethan stood alone one evening by the water after another quiet meeting with Claire, watching the city lights reflect on the dark surface, knowing he was standing at the edge of a choice he had not yet made, aware that whatever came next would change more than just his own heart, and for the first time, he did not turn away from that truth. Part 3 began the day the truth stopped hiding and stepped fully into the light. And it happened faster than Ethan was ready for, because life rarely waits for comfort. And one quiet Monday morning Richard called him into the office with a face that looked older than usual, the sharp confidence worn down by something heavy, and as Ethan sat across from him, he sensed that this was no ordinary meeting, no numbers or deadlines, and Richard spoke plainly, saying he was taking a long leave, saying that his marriage had reached a breaking point months ago, that he and Claire had tried silence, space, and patience, but nothing had filled the distance between them, and that they were now separated in every way that mattered, and Ethan listened carefully, his chest tight, realizing that the secret weight he had been carrying was suddenly no longer a secret at all, and when Richard admitted he felt like he had chosen work over everything else without noticing the cost, Ethan felt a quiet sadness for the man he had once admired without question, because now he saw him as human, flawed, and hurting. After that meeting, the office felt different, lighter and heavier at the same time, because truth has a strange way of doing that, and Ethan walked out into the hallway knowing that nothing he felt had caused this, yet understanding that what he did next mattered more than ever, and that evening he met Claire at a park near the water, not planned, not dramatic, just two people who knew they could no longer pretend nothing was happening, and she told him everything. Calmly, that the separation was real, that she had asked for it, not out of anger but survival, because living unseen had slowly emptied her, and as she spoke, Ethan saw strength in her that he had not noticed before, a quiet courage that came from choosing honesty over comfort, and he did not reach for her hand, did not interrupt, only listened, because this moment was not about romance but clarity, and when she finished, there was a long silence filled only by wind and distant traffic, and Ethan admitted that he cared for her, not impulsively, not dramatically, but with steady truth, saying he had tried to deny it, that he respected boundaries, that he feared hurting others, and Claire met his honesty with her own, saying she felt the same but refused to let anything begin in shadows or guilt, and that agreement became the foundation of everything that followed, because they chose patience over desire. And in the weeks that came after, Richard's absence became permanent, his office emptied quietly, his name removed from schedules, and the company adjusted as businesses always do. But emotionally nothing felt simple, because Ethan carried both relief and sorrow, knowing he was stepping into something meaningful while also witnessing the end of someone else's dream, and during this time, his connection with Claire deepened slowly, through conversations that stretched late into the evening, through shared walks where they spoke about childhood memories, regrets, hopes they had never voiced before, and there was no rush, no secrecy, no crossing of lines too soon, only the steady building of trust, and Ethan found himself changing, becoming more present, more honest, less afraid to speak his truth, while Claire rediscovered parts of herself she thought were gone, laughing more freely, standing taller, breathing easier, and yet doubt lingered in quiet moments, especially for Ethan, who questioned whether love born from complicated timing could ever feel clean. And those doubts followed him until one afternoon when he received an email forwarded by HR, a message from Richard addressed to him personally, thanking him for his professionalism, apologizing for past distance, and wishing him clarity in life. And reading those words, Ethan felt a release he had not known he needed, because forgiveness, even indirect, has power, and that night when he met Claire again, he told her everything, showing her the message, and she cried softly, not from sadness but from closure. Because for the first time, there was no unfinished business standing between them, and Part 3 ended not with a dramatic declaration, but with something far more powerful, a quiet understanding that they were no longer reacting to circumstances, but choosing each other with open eyes, knowing the past but not trapped by it, and as they stood together watching the city lights reflect across the water, Ethan realized that what shocked him most was not falling in love, but how honesty had transformed something fragile into something real. Part 4 arrived quietly, without drama or raised voices, but its impact stayed deeper than anything that came before, because it was the moment when choices became permanent and emotions stopped waiting, and it began with a letter that changed everything, a letter Claire received one clear morning and brought with her when she met Ethan at his apartment, her hand steady but her eyes full, and when she unfolded the pages, she told him it was from Richard, written after months of distance and reflection, and as Ethan read the words, he felt a strange calm settle over him, because the letter held no anger, no blame, only acceptance, Richard admitting his mistakes, acknowledging the loneliness he had ignored, and stating clearly that he was leaving the country for a long-term position, not to escape, but to start over, and most shocking of all, he wrote that he wanted both of them to live honestly, without carrying guilt that did not belong to them, and that message closed a door Ethan had feared would always remain open. And from that moment on, life moved forward with a clarity that felt earned. Claire finalized her separation with grace, choosing peace over resentment, and Ethan stepped into a new role at work, no longer hiding behind routine, no longer afraid of being seen, and together they built something slowly but surely, meeting families, blending routines, learning each other's habits and flaws, Discovering that love was not just connection but effort, patience, and shared direction, and there were challenges, moments when the past resurfaced, when Ethan questioned whether he deserved this happiness, when Claire feared history repeating itself, but instead of silence, they chose conversation, honesty filling the spaces where doubt once lived, and seasons passed, Seattle rain giving way to clear mornings, and the shock Ethan felt was no longer about how the story began, but how strong it had become, because what started as a simple ride home had grown into a partnership built on respect. And one evening, as they walked along the same waterfront where their connection had first deepened, Ethan realized the truth that stayed with him most, that life does not reward perfection, it rewards courage, the courage to be kind, to be honest, to wait when needed, and to choose love without hurting others. And as Claire leaned beside him, calm and certain, Ethan understood that the real shock was not falling for his boss's wife, but discovering that when handled with care, even complicated beginnings can lead to something genuine, lasting, and deeply human.